I've recently heard about a book by Sally McFague entitled Blessed Are the Consumers, which I haven't yet had a chance to read properly, but the bits I've dipped into are very interesting. She talks about consumerism as being the most successful religion on the planet, and she contrasts it with the Christian tradition of kenosis, or self-emptying. This is the Greek word that is used to describe the action of Jesus in laying aside his divinity in order to become truly human and live among us. We hear it described in hymns such as "And Can It Be?", "Emptied himself of all but love." But for us as Christians, it has a wider meaning too, and describes the kind of sacrificial love that we encounter in Jesus and seek to embody in our own living. It really describes the kind of love that puts the needs of others first and leads us into costly giving. Sally McFague offers this idea of self-emptying as a counterbalance to the problems created by consumerism. She describes issues such as climate change, environmental destruction, and financial chaos as resulting from humanity's excess and insatiable appetites. The Christian tradition of self-emptying, self-sacrifice offers a radical message of finding fulfillment in giving that stands starkly in contrast to consumerism's endless desire to acquire more. As an example, Sally McFague tells the story of John Woolman, an 18th century American Quaker. He gave up a successful retail business because he felt that it stopped him seeing clearly something that disturbed him, and that thing was slavery. He came to the realization that money stopped people from clearly seeing injustice. He realized that people reasoned that they had property and land and businesses, and so they needed slaves to maintain them. He realized that when we look at injustices, we see them through our own eyes, from our own situation, and with our own benefit in mind. Woolman knew that he needed to reduce his own level of prosperity in order to really see what was happening around him. Once he did this, he could see more clearly the link between wealth and oppression. Changing his own lifestyle helped him to see the difference between needs and wants. Self-emptying is not about denial, but about fulfillment. It leaves space in our lives for God to fill. It's not about focusing on the things we're denying ourselves and then feeling either grumpy or self-righteous about that. It's about creating that room in our lives where God can be at work. It's about helping us to see more clearly the needs of others and the injustice in the world. Self-emptying leaves space for God to fill, and then we can fulfill our deepest desire to be one with God and align our will with God's. This is not a loss or a diminishment or a denial. This is a gain, a fulfillment. Our reading today is probably a familiar one. I'm sure we've all heard a lot of sermons or Sunday school lessons about it. The danger is that in the church we can make it sound as though we're just after people's money. We might give the impression that we're saying to people, "Look, this widow gave everything she had to live on. Now you need to do the same for the church." Liberation theologians in some of the poorest parts of the world have spoken out against the wealth of the church in communities where people would go without food in order to give money to that institution. Church buildings filled with gold and silver and lavish decoration, standing apart and above the local community, seem abhorrent in the context of desperate poverty and horrendous living conditions. So this is a text we need to be careful with. We often ignore the first part of the reading and jump straight to the second part, the story of the widow. But I think we only really begin to understand what Jesus was saying if we do take notice of the first part. We need that first part if we're going to say more than simply give everything you've got to the church. Jesus begins with a warning and strong words about the institution of the temple. The scribes are singled out again for criticism for their pretentious practices that seem oh so holy, their long robes, their desire to be noticed by others when they're out and about and to be respected, their entitlement to sit in the best seats wherever they go, and to be invited to and honoured at fancy banquets, their prayers that seem to go on forever and use a lot of words, the way they want everyone to think that they are far superior and much more holy than everyone else, and for their exploitation of the poor. Jesus says they devour widows' houses. In other words, they, the scribes and the temple they represent, become rich at the expense of people such as widows, those who are marginalised and vulnerable, lacking resources and protection, those who do not have a voice, and neither do they have those who are willing to speak up on their behalf. Jesus draws attention to this abuse of power and neglect of those on the edges. He draws attention to the attitude that takes from the poorest for its own benefit and reward. He draws attention to the kind of corruption that turns a blind eye to the kind of injustice that might be personally beneficial to us. And then, here comes a widow. This is exactly what Jesus has been talking about. This is the kind of person that the temple system has become rich on exploiting. This is just the kind of person who the scribes will gladly walk all over. The widow isn't just a contrast. Her quiet, understated, and proportionally generous giving isn't the whole of the message. She actually illustrates all that Jesus has been saying about the scribes. She is a concrete example of the victimization of the poor and the innocent by the temple authorities. Jesus is pointing out the injustice of the system. He invites us to witness this and to rail against the kind of institution that takes the last pennies of a vulnerable woman and sees no problem with adding them to its already overflowing coffers. He challenges us to be alert to the injustices of systems of oppression and exploitation, and to strike against them wherever they are. He challenges us to be alert to ourselves and to our dearly beloved church, to recognise those places where we overlook need and injustice because it doesn't suit us to challenge it. He challenges us to empty ourselves and make space for the Spirit to fill, so that our wants and desires do not cloud our vision, and so that we can see clearly what the Spirit wants us to see. Jesus perhaps invites us to become aware of the contradictions in our own lives. Where do we close our eyes to injustice because it doesn't suit us? While we feel we personally benefit from cheap clothing, cheap goods and cheap food, it's easy not to notice the places it comes from, or the people who provide it, or the kind of conditions they might be living and working in. Where is there a tension between our religious life and the other social and economic dimensions that are integral to us? Yes, Jesus calls for wholehearted commitment, and he also calls us to be people who are generous and sacrificial. He calls for self-giving that goes far beyond the financial. But I think he also challenges us to be aware of how we might benefit from exploitation, and he insists on us tackling it, standing up against injustice and oppression and exclusion whenever and wherever we see it. When we commit ourselves fully to Jesus, we offer to him all that we have and all that we are, and we ask that he will transform us and all that we bring to him. Part of that transformation is the opening of our eyes to see injustice, and the opening of our hearts and our hands to act in support of those who suffer. May we be prepared to examine ourselves and see those things that stop us from seeing clearly. May we be willing to give up those things that get in the way and obscure our vision. May we be ready to empty ourselves and create space in our lives for God to fill, so that our deepest desire to be one with God and to align our will and action with God's might be fulfilled. Amen.